I'm outside the Montgomery Greyhound bus station where it all happens, where the freedom rides happened. And Montgomery was not the beginning or the end of the destination, but ultimately it played a pivotal role in the freedom riders being able to help enforce the bus desegregation orders. And what's interesting is there's a federal courthouse right behind this museum. The reason that's important is because one of the lessons that you pick up from this place is ultimately that the law itself needs enforcement. And what that means in some cases is that students and people of principle have to force enforcement of the law. And when they don't do that, lawyers and judges become less prestigious, become feckless in a sense. And so the law has always assumed both an enforcement capacity as well as a legislative capacity, and they don't work without each other. And a judge and a lawyer in the ivory tower is, for the most part, not an active member of the scene. They have to have teeth. And that teeth, that enforcement, comes from, at least in the past, it came from protesters like John Lewis. A couple of the things that I learned here in this very small museum, it's just one floor, the size of about 2 rooms, is, John Lewis, of course, had a pivotal role in this. He actually sued the Greyhound bus station, which was sort of at the end of, it just shows you how it wasn't just, federal court orders regarding education in Brown versus Board of Education. It was a whole federal court district movement across the board. And this is where it really happened here. And it was a way to help enforce the bus desegregation order, because without it, the culture would not move forward without these people forcing local law enforcement to do the right thing. And the first lesson I picked up was that this is really a movement that was both white and black. And I'm trying to see if I can show you this. A lot of the freedom riders were white, and a lot of the violence that was inflicted on the freedom riders was most violently inflicted upon the white colleagues and the white protesters. In particular, this man over here, Jim Zwerg, last name is Z-W-E-R-G, 21 years old, a white exchange student at Fisk University. And it says over here that he drew the mob's most savage attacks because of his race, because of his white race. And ultimately, a lot of the people here were treated worse if they were white than if they were black. They were considered to be traitors to their own race by some of the people in this city. But again, the first thing you notice is that it's not a homogenous movement. You have white and black working side by side. Inside, I saw a woman, Frances Bergman, who was leading, a white woman, a white teacher from Michigan, helping the freedom riders set up. You see a lot of people here and you see cooperation to an extent that really makes you realize that you cannot possibly see the civil rights movement as a white versus black issue, because there were too many white people, despite the fact that they were in the minority, there were too many of them on the ground floor right next to John Lewis, right next to Martin Luther King, right next to Abernathy. And it wasn't just Word, it was quite a few other people. And it looks like over here, in one situation, what would happen was some of the people were stranded. They would be attacked, the bus would be attacked, and some people would be stranded. And, in some cases, people were not able to get a taxi to get out of there. And in some cases, a driver, we'd have a black-owned taxi that's operating under, segregation laws. And the black-owned taxi would only pick up the black protesters and not the white ones in order to comply with the law. And the white protesters were left standing there. One of them was beaten unconscious. That was Zwerg, was beaten unconscious and didn't get medical treatment for an hour, if I remember correctly. So again, not a homogenous movement, not as simple as white versus black. The other thing you want to pick up on is the complexity of the legal environment. So John Lewis sued, John Lewis was part of a lawsuit. But what was really happening is you have a couple of interesting situations where the federal district courts would get involved, and when that didn't work because the law is expensive and the litigation is expensive, ultimately at the end of all these different court cases, it was the executive branch through the ICC, I believe the Interstate Commerce something, that finally, forced the law, it's finally passed. Essentially, what I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it would have to be an executive order by the president, or it would have to be an order by the agency's head that clearly outlaws on a federal basis segregation on buses across the country. That's where the federal government is so important in the civil rights movement, because you had such a patchwork of different attitudes and different enforcement mechanisms, despite the fact that the protesters were operating under the same principle. When they would go to Mississippi, it would be a different attitude than when they would go into Nashville, and so on and so forth. But so the federal government had to get involved at some point. And in one of the most poignant pictures, you see a National Guardsman standing while a black freedom rider is sitting down on a bus, and the National Guardsman is standing next to him to protect him. So you have all this really interesting interplay. And what people should realize, and it's not obvious, again, is why is the federal government getting involved? It's getting involved so that to harmonize the law across the board. And for the most part, in any movement, federal government gets involved as a last resort, because you have the problem of politics where national politicians have to satiate voters across the board, and they're not going to do that on their own because it's too controversial. They don't want to lose votes. And so the ICC came in at the very end. The federal government came in at the very end when you had publicity that was damaging to the Americans' reputation. And along the way, with John Lewis and everyone else, that harmonization of the law, that national order, when you think federal government, what you have to think to yourself is, I got a federal district court over here. What does that federal district court do? That district court harmonizes the law across the country. And when that happens, it overcomes local resistance. And that's this federal district court back over here. That's what the federal courts do. And they're not going to be able to do it on their own because of politics, right? You have to have a litigant. You have to have a plaintiff that actually comes in and helps either create a case or helps motivate national politicians to do something. Because remember, these politicians that are part of that federal court district are going to be in Washington, D.C. They're not in Mississippi for the most part. Of course, there's federal agencies. They're not in Mississippi. They're not, they're sitting in their local divisions and not necessarily able to figure out what's going on their own without people like John Lewis, without people like Martin Luther King, and all the people around those movements and around those organizations. So the second thing you want to realize is, why is there such a patchwork? It's because a lot of the movement is attempting to force enforcement through the federal government by way of harmonizing on a national level this patchwork of regulation. And so when we talk about states' rights, we talk about all these other issues, that's all mixed in there somewhere. So the last thing I'm trying to think, so we've got the federal versus state issue, which is really a harmonization issue. You have the idea that you need protesters, in most cases students, to force enforcement of the law so that the judicial branch and the legislative branch maintain honor and, quite frankly, relevance. You had the fact that this is not a racially homogenous movement. I had one more thing I wanted to say that I picked up on over here. I'm just waiting for it to come back to me. Let me see if I can walk around a little bit so that it comes back to me. Oh, that's right. It was not a racially homogenous movement. The worst violence was actually happening to white people that were part of the Freedom Riders. And so you have, again, the fact that you have the ICC coming in, the Interstate Commerce Commission coming in at the very end. So you have Robert Kennedy working behind the scenes, despite the fact that he's an attorney general. You have, again, this strange situation where, because litigation is oftentimes time-consuming and expensive, what's really happening is, at some point, you even have to bypass the federal district court and go straight to the agency to be able to overcome, in a sense, the slow-wheeling movements of justice, the slow turning of the wheel of justice. So what you're really looking at when you think about the structure of this country, legislative, executive, judicial, none of these branches work in isolation. They literally have to work together in order to work, in order to have an effect that's worthy of any sort of progress. And that's what was happening here. I think that's, the police, that's my last thing. In some cases, you'll notice that John Lewis gets off the bus and he's arrested right away. And a lot of people are horrified by that. What might actually be happening is the police are actually protecting John Lewis, because if they don't arrest him right away, he might get beaten by the mob, by the anti-protesters. So when you hear about somebody getting arrested right away, being put in jail, whether it's in Mississippi or here or in Nashville, you can't assume right away that the police are on the wrong side of the movement. You know, the police may be on the right side of the movement by default in trying to maintain order. And the easiest way to maintain order is to get somebody away from the protesters, to get somebody away from the mob. And that's in some cases what happens when you arrest John Lewis the second he gets off the bus. And when they didn't do that, in some cities, one of the reasons that the first freedom rides failed, I think the bus was actually burned down, so it had to start over again. In one of the cities, I don't remember which one, ultimately the police were on a stay away order for 15 minutes. The police chief told the cops, don't interfere, wait 15 minutes, with the understanding that in those 15 minutes of inaction, the protesters would be beaten violently and senselessly. And then the police would get involved to maintain order. So you can see how, again, and in some cases here, this is actually, it was organized on both sides. That's a police officer, off-duty police officer, who's also part of the Klan. And yeah, a mob leader attacks the newsman covering the Freedom Riders' arrival in Montgomery, which happened right here, in 1961. Inside, it actually has a little bit more detail. It talks about the man being also a member of the KKK. Off-duty police officers and KKK sometimes overlapped in the South. And so you have an organized movement on both sides, because what would happen was, in order to prevent photos and videos, what would happen was a lot of the off-duty police officers, or even the police, would go after the journalists that were accompanying the Freedom Riders first. They would attack the journalists first. If you look over here, I believe you can see that over here. That's a camera. So there was organization on all sides, and violence all over the place. But so you can't assume that the police were knowingly supporting in every single instance the Klan, or you can't assume that they were against John Lewis or against the civil rights movement. You have to really think about the environment overall. What was really happening when the police would arrest somebody as soon as they got off that bus in a hostile environment? Which would be more preferable, the police not doing anything for 15 minutes and then coming in, or the police acting right away? So I think those are the lessons that I picked up on over here. And, so you have this interplay between all the different branches. And if you're in Montgomery, I suggest you come here. It's only $5.